Today's topic is How American Democracy Has Reformed Itself After Prior Crises. Dr. Jeremi Suri, our speaker, is an international historian of the modern world, fascinated by the connections between people, ideas, and societies. His work focuses on policymaking, governance, social movements, and cultural misunderstandings or understandings. Dr. Suri has a joint appointment in the LBJ School of Public Affairs and at the University of Texas at Austin, College of Liberal Arts, Department of History. He's the author of 4 books and has received numerous awards for his research and teaching, and Smithsonian Magazine named him one of America's top young innovators in the arts and sciences in 2007.
Thank you so much, Angie. I am so delighted to be here with all of you today. I know there are many friends on, and I'm sure there's some critics on as well, and that's great. I have the great joy of being a historian of democracy. I've written a number of books about the topic. I do a lot of writing in other contexts. I do a lot of lecturing about it. And in many ways, this difficult moment our society is living through is a moment that really prompts us to think about this history. And that's what I want to do today. I'm going to try not to talk too much about the president-elect and the outgoing president. I'm going to talk more about our history and how our history can help us understand this moment. And spoiler alert, there are no simple solutions for the world we're in today. But I want to give us the perspective to understand that the world we're in is not that different from the past. We have this false notion that our democracy continues to grow and improve with every generation. The reality is that improvement over time is uneven and inconsistent, and we go backwards and forwards at the same time. In fact, the miracle of American democracy is its messiness and its constant moving in multiple directions. The metaphor for American democracy is not a steady upward arc, but more a roller coaster. And maybe over time, that roller coaster does have an arc toward justice, as Martin Luther King said. But it is a roller coaster ride. It always has been. And I wanted to start with some poetry for that reason, because we have enough punditry these days. And poetry, in fact, captures more of our society. As a historian, I've become more and more convinced that poets understand our age and our society better than many of us who aren't poets. So I'm going to read first a little bit from Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman. It's a poem he wrote in 1855. He's one of the great poets of American democracy, and he captures the messiness, the uncertainty of what American democracy meant in the 19th century. Here's Whitman. I have heard that the talkers were talking, the talk of the beginning and the end. But I do not talk of the beginning or the end. There was never any more inception than there is now, nor any more youth or age than there is now, and will never be any more perfection than there is now, nor any more heaven or hell than there is now. Urge and urge and urge, always the procreant urge of the world. Out of the dimness, opposite equals advance. Always substance and increase, always sex. Always a knit of identity, always distinction, always a breed of life. To elaborate is no avail. Learned and unlearned feel that it is so. They feel that it is so. The 19th century, like our world today, was filled with strongly held beliefs expressed in all kinds of ways, often at the cost of what we're seeing as scientific and democratic principles by many. Allen Ginsberg, a poet you also have all heard of, followed up on Whitman 100 years later, writing in the shadow of McCarthyism, writing in the shadow of some of the more difficult moments, especially for those in American society who challenged norms after World War II. Allen Ginsberg wrote a response to Whitman, or an application of Whitman, an extension into the 20th century. He called his poem A Supermarket in California. And I have to give praise to my son, Zachary Suri. This is a poem that Zachary found and flagged for me. I had not known this poem before my son found it as he tried to navigate our world today. This is Allen Ginsberg. Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight? Will we walk all night through solitary streets? The trees add shade to shade. Lights out in the houses. We'll both be lonely. Will we stroll dreaming of the lost America, of love, past blue automobiles and driveways, home to our silent cottage and our lost past. Ah, dear Father Graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, what America did you have when Karen quit poling his ferry and you got out on a smoking bank and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of Lethe? That's a reference to Greek mythology. Of course, Karen is the Greek rower who rows people across in mythology across the river to their death as they see their lives slip away. I read these poems because they're beautiful and they capture the essence of what I think is the American experience that I've written about in so many places, studied in such depth, but yet always struggled to express, which is that our democracy does not match the parchment upon which our words of our Constitution are written. Our democracy has never been a simple thing. It has always been riven with division, always been riven with fighting, always been riven with counter arguments to arguments, questions about facts. We are a society of amazing accomplishment and resistant know-nothingness. We are a society of innovators and a society stuck in the past, and we always have been. It is the roller coaster of American democracy. We have a myth we tell ourselves. It's the myth that's often in our high school history books of constant progress and the belief that our past is long past, that we don't need to think about that past anymore. If there's anything that the last few years have taught us, it's that the past, in William Faulkner's terms, is not past. The past is not past. It is with us. It stays with us. It defines us. It influences us in so many ways. What I want to do in this lecture is hopefully open a conversation that I hope will be useful for all of us as we navigate the next few weeks and months and years with what will be a very rough transition from one presidential administration to another. And we deal with all sorts of challenges in our society, challenges that are not new. I think we need to talk about this in three ways that I will discuss today to get the conversation going. This is an introduction to a way to think about these issues. It's actually the subject of the new book that I'm writing right now as we speak, or that I would be writing right now if I weren't having the privilege to lecture to all of you right now. First, I want to talk about other moments of what I'm calling diminished democracy or democracy in crisis, moments when we've seen our society pulled apart, how many moments there are of this in our past, how frequent this is. That's the point here. No two moments are the same. But this is part of our history and part of who we are, not the textbook examples, but the models, the experiences of division, of difficulty. Then I want to talk about some common elements. What is it that does unite these moments? Why do we recurringly go into these moments of difficulty? And then I want to talk about how these moments have provided opportunities, not inevitabilities, but opportunities for reform and improvement. Because every turn down in the roller coaster has created momentum for a turn up. Every decline has provided, at least in our history to this date, an opportunity for a rise. In fact, you could argue that the moments when American society and American democracy is most stable, those moments are often the moments of least accomplishment. Our moments of accomplishment have also been our moments of degeneracy. Our moments of decline have also opened our moments for rise. That might be Greek in and of itself. It might be the cyclical nature of Greek history that we've inherited as the inheritors of Athenian democracy in many ways. Another way of putting this is that authoritarian societies, non-democratic societies, traditional societies can maintain perhaps more stability than a democracy, a large, diverse, pluralistic society like our own, which James Madison predicted would be a society where it would be difficult for any one group to dominate. And the constant rivalries between many different groups would produce, he said, what would be the productive but also perhaps the dangerous and violent changes, the dangerous and violent twists and turns and pulls that are what our democracy is all about. That is not to diminish the challenges, no, to diminish the pain and suffering. It is actually to dive deep in and understand how present that has been in our history and how important that is to understanding who we are and where our society is today. So let's talk a little bit about some of these moments of diminished democracy, as I call them. And it's one of the challenges when we think deeply about what democracy is. That's one of the themes of our podcast, the weekly podcast I do, which you can see over my head here. This is democracy. How's that for product placement, by the way? We have trouble understanding what democracy really means because we have always been as far from democracy in its aspiration as we hope. But our hope has always been as great to be a democracy. Our aspirations have always been somewhat unmet. We have always pursued democracy, but fallen short in one way or another. The most significant moment, of course, that everyone is conscious of is the Civil War. And it's still ever present in our debates about statues and names and songs today. The Civil War, of course, was a moment when American society was not simply divided by region, but divided in the very conceptualization of what democracy meant. And those divisions lasted through Reconstruction. I've been doing a lot of work on this recently, and it's extraordinary in the research to find how deeply people conceived of democracy in fundamentally different ways, North and South, Democrat and Republican, slaveholding and non-slaveholding. You have all these divisions within Texas itself, as well as between North and South. For those of the newly formed Republican Party, who in some cases were abolitionists, in many cases were not, democracy meant that all men should have the ability to vote and to be productive economic actors. In the words of the predecessor to the Republican Party, the Free Labor Party, democracy was to be a society with free labor, free men, free soil, where every human being, every male human being would have the right to work, to be compensated for his work, to own land, and to contribute to a productive capitalist economy. That was the vision of democracy: sovereignty in labor, sovereignty in work. We would come to call that later entrepreneurship in some respects, entrepreneurship. The Democratic Party, which was the older party, the party of Thomas Jefferson, was the party that also spoke of democracy. But its conceptualization of democracy was a democracy of landed elites and the power of land and person on land, which is to say that those who owned the land had a right to run the society, that sovereignty was based upon land ownership. We have never lost that notion entirely. And that those who were unlanded were not to have the same rights and privileges, and those who were of the wrong races were potentially the property of those who were landed. It was a government of landed elites, which in fact had a longer historical tradition in democratic thinking than the notion of the universal subject, the entrepreneurial subject of the Republican Party. These, don't get it wrong, these were both perceptions of democracy held too deeply. And the crisis of American democracy was that both sides, but particularly those who held to the Southern democratic vision, were willing to bring the entire democratic structure down to protect their conceptualization of democracy, that their conceptualization justified the destruction of the institutions that were moving firmly against it because of the nature of American population, the nature of American economic growth, and because of slave resistance, which required more and more effort and resources that were not available to maintain that. After the Civil War, this conceptualization, this conflict, this diminishment of democracy, this violent conflict did not end. It did not end. What I found in my research, and I'm certainly not the first historian to find this, is that Southerners, Confederates who lost, did not believe that their conception had been defeated. They did not believe that just because they lost the battles and lost the votes that they had actually lost. They believed they had a legitimate claim. They believed that things had been rigged and taken from them, and that although the Union had more power, having greater power was not necessarily a source of greater legitimacy. And the period from the 1870s until the 1890s was filled with repeated backsliding efforts by local and national actors to reverse the actions of the Civil War. This was most deeply felt in states like Texas, where you had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, where you had increased vigilante justice, lynchings, where empowered local officials, often police officers, often empowered local law enforcement, used their law enforcement powers to disproportionately harm, and in many cases to directly maim and kill those who were seen as threatening the democratic order, which was a white landed elite democratic order in Texas and in other parts of the South. This continued through the 1870s and 1890s. If there was a low point in America's democratic history, that certainly was it, particularly the period after the Civil War, when the constitutional reforms ran against the realities in these areas. Let me flash forward to another period where we saw backsliding on democracy, the period after World War I, the first Red Scare in American society. This was following the Russian Revolution, but also following the period in American history when we had the most immigration. The number of foreign-born Americans in the early 20th century reached a number and a proportion it had not been at since before independence, which is to say there were a higher proportion of North American-born Americans at the founding than there were in the early 20th century. The United States was more diverse and more rapidly becoming diverse than it had ever been before in the early 20th century. And the Red Scare was a reaction against that, in many ways triggered by the president who espoused the words of democracy, the first Southern president since the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson, but who brought this conceptualization of democracy, which was antithetical to diversity, to Washington, D.C. Woodrow Wilson re-segregated the federal civil service, and he contributed through his Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, to an effort to a nationwide effort to find those who were seen as radical socialists, those who had been infected with Bolshevik ideas. And in many cases, these individuals were deported from the United States. It's also the last period of mass deportations from the United States. Many of you may know, for example, that one of the most prominent female advocates of political reform at the time, Emma Goldman, was actually deported from the United States during this period. This was also a period of increased violence and increased lynching. In parts of the country like Texas, fears of Bolshevism were used to justify breaking up groups of African-American churches, African-American political activists. It was justification for going after those African-American, or as they were called, Negro, and other words were used too, Negro radicals. This Red Scare was actually to some extent brought to a close by Herbert Hoover and others in the mid-1920s. But we had a recurrence of this, of course, with the early Great Depression. People forget when they talk about the Great Depression, it was not just a decline in the fabric of America's economy, but also in the social fabric of the United States. By 1932, you had veterans from World War I who were actually in open revolt against the US government. This is what the bonus marchers were about. These were veterans from World War I who were starving, who demanded a bonus for their service to the government. When they were denied this bonus, they camped out in many cities. They became a sort of a large homeless population, a shanty population as it was called at the time. And they built these little towns inside of cities called Hoovervilles. In Washington, D.C., you had one of the largest, and as many of you know, in his last days in the presidency, Herbert Hoover called in the U.S. military to forcibly clear these veterans who were in open revolt against the US government. So just imagine that. Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur, neither of whom were famous yet as they would become after World War II, being brought in to clear these veterans who were in open revolt against their own government. And one more example of democratic decline, one more example of the difficulties our democracy has had is, of course, the period of McCarthyism after World War II. I would argue World War II was a great period of democratic expansion for the United States, but it did produce a reaction in the McCarthyite period, which was not just about Joe McCarthy, but a broader early 1950s reaction against what were seen as foreign influences in the United States and elites. It was an attack upon what were seen as elite figures who had become too powerful in the context of the war, too cosmopolitan. As the great historian Richard Hofstadter put it a few generations ago, this was the moment when the paranoid style of American politics that lurks under the idealism of our democracy, when that paranoid style reached its apex. In many ways, Hofstadter could have been writing about QAnon and conspiracy theorists today. They were there in the late 40s and early 1950s. I also remind my students that McCarthyism was the first reality television. Joe McCarthy was the first reality TV star, along with Roy Cohn. What did Joe McCarthy do? He went around the country, held hearings where he brought famous people in, like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, and he embarrassed them on TV. And people loved watching it. If you go back and you read the diaries of the time, this was the great television experience, to watch Joe McCarthy, this drunk supper club person from Wisconsin, to watch him slay these elite figures on television, to embarrass them. I go through these periods not to diminish the magnitude and majesty of American democracy. I think it's a startling achievement that our democracy has achieved as much as it has. I go through these examples to show how many difficulties we've been through and how our history is filled with the rise and fall of democratic experiences and democratic practices, often coterminously, that you can have the experience of World War II, which is truly a great expansion of democracy, with the creation, for example, after World War II, of the first integrated units in the American military. But at the same time, you can have the rise of incredible hatred and violence toward American citizens, immigrants in particular, at the same moment occurring within American society. Our democracy moves in multiple directions at the same time. It is a deep and messy experience, and it is susceptible, and always has been susceptible, to demagogues and those who use the rhetoric of democracy to diminish the institutions of democracy that actually on a day-to-day basis protect most citizens. This is an old story. What are the common elements? Ladies and gentlemen, partisanship is front and center. We have always been a partisan society. The only nonpartisan moment are the first 4 years, and even really less, of George Washington's presidency. We have been partisan from the very beginning. And by the way, throughout our history, the most partisan moments are the moments when most people vote. Partisanship brings people out to vote. When people feel an affiliation, a strong affiliation with a party, they give money and they vote. That's why we had high turnout this year. That's why we had extremely high turnout, because of the partisanship. The nonpartisan moments are the moments of less participation. Take the 1970s as a counterpoint to where we are now. We've always been deeply regional. We are a big nation with big regional differences. If I had more time, I was going to show you some PowerPoints of elections over time. And what is striking is how rarely the states shift. I wrote a piece for CNN about this a few days ago. Our elections are really, not much changes over time. Throughout the late 19th century, we had long periods of regnant partisanship, where there was very little shift. 1 or 2 states deciding whether Grover Cleveland or William McKinley becomes president. That's true today. Joe Biden's victory in this election looks strikingly like Barack Obama's in 2012. Compare 2012 to 2020, you do not see much difference. You do not see much difference. In fact, the big difference between today and 2016 is the difference in popularity for Hillary Clinton in 3 upper Midwestern states, and the ability of Joe Biden, with the help of LBJ and UT history graduate Stacey Abrams, the ability of Joe Biden to win in Georgia and in Arizona to some extent. But other than that, the partisanship, the regionalism, they overlap. We can talk about that much more. Ladies and gentlemen, racism is at the center of our history. It doesn't explain everything, and it matters in different ways at different times, but you can't get around the fact that races matter consistently. Race has always been an issue. Different views of how different races should be included or not included in our democracy. I can tell you as a historian, there's no period when it's not ever present. It is, as Gunnar Myrdal put it, the true American obsession. The true American obsession. Our elections, our politics are always violent too. In fact, we are living through a period now that's less violent so far, and I hope it stays that way. The late 19th century elections were filled with, some would argue, alcohol and guns. Alcohol and guns. And our system has always been about winner take all. It's set up that way. It's set up that way. You get all of the presidency or none of it. You get all of the state electors or none of them. You get all of the 1 or 2 Senate seats or none of them. It's not a coalitional system. It's a dichotomous system. It's a winner take all system. All of those elements, partisanship, regionalism, racism, violence, our winner take all system, they've all contributed to what makes for these messy, difficult periods and difficult transitions. We have this myth that power is transitioned in our society in peaceful ways. My gosh, go and ask someone who was in 19th century politics if that was true. It was not. It was not at the presidential or the state level. It hasn't been true in our country, even at the national level in the 20th century. Herbert Hoover, after losing the election in 1932, losing a true landslide, losing by 17% of the popular vote. Joe Biden will win the popular vote probably by 4 or 5%. Herbert Hoover lost it by 17%. Hoover still didn't think that he owed the new president anything. He spent his last months in office trying to undermine everything Roosevelt was planning to do. He spent his last months in office trying to prevent Roosevelt, his successor, from succeeding. He even tried to blackmail his successor, promising that he would only save the banks, step in as the Federal Reserve asked, if Roosevelt would do other things that Hoover wanted him to do. He wanted the new president who had been elected with a 17% majority. He wanted the new president to actually sign on to do his things, even though he had lost. No one gives up power easily. We have done it relatively peacefully, but not easily, and certainly not smoothly in our society. We have had some recent examples where it has been quite smooth, and Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama deserve credit for that in the last two transitions, but that is not the norm. That is not the norm at all. So how have these moments, these dark moments, I fear it's a dark picture I've painted here, how have these dark moments also contributed to positive change in our society? How have we survived? How have we gotten through things? You might be asking yourself that today. How can we get through this? Will this ever end? Will it ever get better? Can we ever move forward, or are we stuck in this mess? Is this the end? Is this the end? There's no end to history. And American democracy has proven remarkably resilient. I don't have a crystal ball. But I want to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about what this history teaches us, not simply about the difficulties, the complexities, the darkness of our democracy, but also about the bright lights, the possibilities, how reform comes from these difficult moments, how the darkness produces the light, or how the flooding of the field makes the soil more fertile for future growth and development. How have we reformed? How have we improved in these moments? I think there are a number of elements of this that are absolutely crucial. We are a society, for all of the challenges, all of the violence, all of the division, we have always been a society of law. We've always been a society of law. Our debates have been about control of the law, rewriting the law, using the law. And the process surrounding legal structures has always been reinforced by the conflicts within those structures, which is to say that the decisions in the end have always been made by those who are able to best mobilize the legal processes to their purpose. Best mobilize the legal processes to their purpose. There is a fundamental conservatism, lowercase c, about American politics and American society. Even though we talk of revolution, we really are not revolutionaries. Even though we talk of transformation, we really are not transformational. We believe in, out of habit, out of experience, out of imbibed culture, we believe in something about our processes. That doesn't mean you have to agree with the way the votes were counted. But in the end, the person who has more votes has the process and the law overwhelmingly on their side. The person who can mobilize the law has the upper hand. And during these moments of difficulty and conflict, people have turned to the law, and the law has been reinforced. Not always in its fairness, ladies and gentlemen, but in its presence in our society. The best example I could give of this that might resonate with you is the election of 1876, when there was no clear winner, unlike this election, when there were three states where it was unclear who had the most votes. It is crystal clear who has the most votes today. But this time it was unclear who had the most votes for all kinds of reasons. One of them being that you had different people collecting votes. You did not have a smooth process as we had in this last year, where all the votes went to a set of state designated elected officials who oversaw the counting of these votes with oversight for that process. It was just the opposite. And so you had three states, particularly Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina, that had multiple different voting totals. And you had a question over who would become the new president, Samuel Tilden or Rutherford B. Hayes. The process went on for many weeks, in fact, for many months. In the end, the process was resolved by the courts and by Congress through an effort to identify, as best they could, how the votes really tallied, but more than that, to create a legal structure for this. One side did not get to win because it could mobilize more guns or more people, though people started to talk about that. Hayes won because the Republicans were able to mobilize more legal authority. They made better claims about the legal structure of the voting counts by their vote counters. They had more of the law on their side as they went through the court system. And then in the end, they were able to persuade through the law more people that their position was the legitimate position. Our election is nowhere near as difficult as that to resolve. It's quite clear where our election stands. But the point here is that even then, when it wasn't clear, it was not actual gunfire, although there was a lot of it that decided the election, it was law. Our processes are enormously powerful, and they become empowered. When we disagree, we rely on process. We rely on the most basic of things. That is why we have had low-scale violence, but not organized revolutionary violence very much in our history. Americans, as many other historians have also commented, Americans love to fight over their ideas and beliefs, but they fundamentally believe that our basic processes must go forward. Our basic processes must go forward. There are many elections in our history where the losers deny that they lost, but they accept that they are out of power and fight to get back into power. The losers do not admit that they have lost, but they leave power and fight to get back into power. The Constitution requires that. The Constitution does not require any concession. It simply requires that with the passage of time, those who have followed the process and had the most votes, that they take over, and those who have the least votes, no matter what they say, they leave. That has happened repeatedly. In fact, hundreds of times at the level of state executives, and tens of times at the level of US presidents. Our processes are actually reinforced. Our laws get strengthened. Think how much we're all thinking today about the importance of law and how our arguments over law, how frivolous lawsuits being thrown out of court will reinforce, in fact, the power and importance of the law. And again, don't get me wrong, when I talk about the power of the law, I don't mean the perfection of the law. It's unequal, but it's still a process. Our processes move forward. Our processes move forward. Our processes are actually reinforced. You could argue the staying power of the American Constitution is less, that all people believe in it. Most people don't even read it. It's that the processes it puts in place are processes that have become imbibed in our society. They're part of who we are. And they're very hard to work one's way out of. They are part of our social matrix, and we are all committed to them one way or another. Think how hard it is if you're an elected official who's been elected by a process to then say the process is unfair because someone else who won elected was not elected. Think how difficult it is to do that in a society of laws. I've studied other societies where it's not difficult to do that because they're not societies of law. Law and order in our history has not been about a police power. In fact, the policing power has sometimes not been about law and order. Law and order has been about processes for political representation and accountability and the legal structures around them. It's amazing. I've actually come to say positive things about lawyers. It surprises me myself. This is a good sign in my research that it's actually forcing me to say things I wouldn't have said otherwise. In addition to processes, our democracy becomes vibrant, dynamic, and survives, and in fact progresses during these dark moments because of new actors. This is another big takeaway. It is not the established elites who save democracy. You might have noticed that recently too. It is not the established elites. Those who have established power are the cowards. They've always been. Because if you have established power, you're afraid to lose it. You have so much to lose. You have so much to lose. The people who are most consistently supporters of democratic process and change are those who the process empowers for the first time. That's why many of us who have immigrant parents had immigrant parents who loved American democracy. Both of my parents were immigrants. And democracy, they would carp and argue about all kinds of things they didn't like. But boy, was it powerful to them that American democracy offered them an opportunity. The process had to work because only the working of the process gave them a chance. They didn't have money, my parents, to be corrupt, to buy their way in. They didn't have fancy educational titles like I have to get access to things. They just had to rely on the process, and they believed in the process, even though they knew it had problems, because it was only by reinforcing what our democracy is supposed to be about that they could have any chance. It's the only way they could have any chance. It is new actors. After the Civil War, the most important democracy activists were the freed slaves. the Booker T. Washingtons, the Frederick Douglasses. Frederick Douglass put this very well at the time. He said, the future of American democracy will be defined by the freed slaves, not by the longtime holders of the slaves. By the freed slaves, not the longtime holders of the slaves. Think about that in the arts as well. Think about that in all elements of our culture. Where does the vibrancy come? Where is the innovation and technology? It's always from the new actors. It's always, as the art historian Ken Clark put it, it's always from those on the margin seeking to get to the center, rather than those who are already in the center. That's sort of what's made Texas a state of incredible dynamism, because it's not New York, right? That's what's made places like Texas and the peoples who come through, the German immigrants, the Mexican immigrants, the Jewish immigrants. It's what's made the African Americans and others who've come through this state. It's what's made this state a source of dynamism, not the established families. New actors defending the principles, new actors pushing the margins, new actors demanding fairness, new actors mobilizing new resources. That has been the salvation for democracy. And those new actors get activated, just as has happened in our own world today, by the attack upon the promise of democracy as they see it. So we have the process of law, we have the new actors, and then we do have leaders who matter. And this is something I talk a lot about with students and when I lecture to business leaders and others. Leadership really matters. But I think the case for leaders who are all-seeing, who are geniuses, who are know-it-alls, who change the world because they've seen something, because they have some vision, is terribly overstated. I don't think that's what a good business leader is. I don't think that's what a good coach is. I don't think that's what a good university president is. I don't think that's what a good political leader is. People need new ideas. They need visionary inspiration. That's all important. But leadership fundamentally is about bringing people together. During our moments of division, it has been the process of law that's held us together. It's been the new actors who have pushed us to remember who we are. And it's been then a small group of leaders who have arisen in that context to find a way to knit us back together, and never to knit everyone back together. We're too big a society and we have never been united. Even Herbert Hoover, who I mentioned before, who suffered the worst presidential loss of any president up for election in 1932, he still had about 40% of the vote. Even Herbert Hoover, right? If you can do that as Herbert Hoover in the midst of a depression, you know that there's never going to be 100%. But what leaders do, what an Abraham Lincoln does, what a Theodore Roosevelt does, a Franklin Roosevelt, a Dwight Eisenhower, what a Fannie Lou Hamer did, what a Jane Addams did, what suffragist leaders did, is they brought large groups of people together as they had not been brought together before. They brought them together not in agreement on everything, but in agreement on purpose, in organization and in goals. They found a way not to find a stale center, but to move the discussion left or right and bring more people along from the center. I don't think you very often move people from the extremes. It's those who are closer to the center, who get moved a little bit in one direction. You come back closer to them and you pull them a little bit with you. It is the power of defining a set of common interests and a common moral purpose and a desire to escape the mess, the division that is offending people who might be even a source of that division initially themselves. It is the desire to find a comfortable place in an uncomfortable part of democracy. It is a desire to bring people back together and to call upon them to see that they can work together and accomplish more working together than working apart. And again, that's never everyone, but it's bringing more people to that realization. This is what struck Alexis de Tocqueville about American society when he visited in the 1830s, how different we were, but how we still found ways to work together. Leaders build bridges and connect people to accomplish things, even if they have different conceptualizations. They bring people together to work together despite their differences. That's what Madison meant by pluralism. We keep our differences. We continue to have different religions, to have different points of view, but we find ways to work together. The leaders build the bridges. The leaders find ways to bring people who still disagree together in larger number to accomplish more things. It's less sexy than just talking about ideological purity, but it's actually what real leadership is. The model is, of course, Abraham Lincoln. or Franklin Roosevelt, or many others, I thought I would close by reading to you Lincoln's first inaugural address, which did not prevent a civil war. He gave this address on the eve of Fort Sumter, on the eve of the outbreak of the Civil War. A number of Southern states had already seceded. So his words didn't succeed in preventing a civil war, but they provided the basis for bringing so many Northerners, disparate Northerners, together, and ultimately bringing the country back together somewhat after the Civil War. These words anticipated his second inaugural. They anticipated the programs of Ulysses Grant and others, and the Freedmen's Bureau, and so many African-American activists. These words inspired Frederick Douglass as much as they inspired white listeners in 1861. Lincoln's first inaugural. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. The paradox of American democracy, ladies and gentlemen, is that we constantly see the worst of human nature in a free society, and it is the only thing that reminds us of the best of human nature. The urge to find the better angels of our nature is embedded in our law. It's embedded in the arrival of new groups as political actors, young, diverse, and it's embedded in the visions of true leaders who are less all-knowing, but more uniting, less categorical, and more committed to compromise, not for a stale center, but for mutual accomplishment on the things that matter most to us. We are in a dark time, but we're also in a bright time. And I expect that we'll see more bad behavior, but also more bright lights of change in the next few weeks and months. That will not make it easier to sleep. I feel like I haven't slept in weeks. But it will mean that we are continuing our strange, magical, disruptive, but also sometimes beautiful historical journey as Americans. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a part of that journey.
First up, would you say that the democratic process prevailed if Trump had won? Are you saying that whatever happens is an affirmation of the processes without regard to his undermining of democratic principles?
It's a great question. I would have said if Donald Trump won more votes in more states and more of the popular vote, I would have said the process worked. If you don't follow the votes, you are not following the electoral process. It's as simple as that, right? I don't have to like the outcome, but I have to affirm the process. And I can even say after the outcome, the person did all these things they shouldn't have done and they shouldn't have been elected. But nonetheless, they had more votes or they didn't have more votes. Look, I'm not happy with the way the Senate race went in Texas. I'm revealing my own personal views here, right? But John Cornyn got more votes. I'm angry about it, yes. I think he said things he shouldn't have said. I think he's unethical. These are just my personal views. But he got more votes. That's the process. That's the process. I also want to change the process so it's easier for some people to vote. But under the process, the way it was, he got more votes, just as Joe Biden got 50,000 more votes, probably more votes in excess in Pennsylvania than Donald Trump.
Thank you. Has the general level of literacy education affected the swings in the health of democracy?
It's a great question. And I wish I could say that more literacy and more education actually made us a more stable democracy, but I don't think so, actually. It's extraordinary how many educated people do things that run against the patterns of democracy, and how many uneducated people become extraordinary activists for democracy. I will say, though, that I think a more educated public is generally a good thing. What we have seen is that, again, understanding process is an educational element, and people will be educated to understand how things work and educated in a sense of civic responsibility. And if I might say so, I think we've dropped the ball on that a little bit in the last few decades. One of the challenges we have now is because we underfund teaching, especially, I don't mean at the university level, it's almost too late then. At the K through 12 level, we have too many people who come of age, even bright kids, who don't understand basic civics And that's long been a problem, but that is something we can and should be able to fix in our society.
Thank you. This next question has a lot of context. So if the Constitution gives the state legislatures the power to appoint the electors to the Electoral College, how do we prevent state legislatures in states controlled by the Republican Party from appointing Trump electors if the state law does not require them to follow the results of the election, or if the results of the election in that state are still in dispute when the electors must be appointed?
Right. So many states, if not all, many states do require that the state designate electors based on who wins the popular vote in that state. Pennsylvania is one of those states. I looked it up. So the legislature in Pennsylvania has no say. Biden has won the state. It will be certified that he won the state. The electors go to him. There's no way around that. The only case really where the state legislators have any real power to step in is if there's a dispute over who's won in the state, which was the case in 2000 with Florida. And that is in part what the Supreme Court resolved by stopping the vote count. We're not in any of these states in that place right now. We're not even close. Let me put it this way, and this is not to take a side, it's just to point out the obvious. Joe Biden's margin of victory is 3 times Trump's in the battleground states, in the states where you'd see this, and he's not reliant on one particular state. So I don't foresee that being an issue. I foresee people continuing to talk about that and raise fears about that. But there's no conceivable way I can imagine Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan designating other electors other than the electors for Joe Biden from those states. And I would think that would be the case for Georgia and Arizona as well. I don't know enough about Georgia and Arizona to be as certain about that.
Thanks so much. Next question is, it seems remarkable that Nixon did not legally challenge the Kennedy victory. The vote was close and arguably questionable. What led to Nixon's decision?
It's a great question, and many historians have asked this, especially because we know where Nixon goes thereafter that, right? It's not, we would say he was some paragon of ethics and integrity. First of all, Nixon believed that if he did that, if he challenged the vote, there would be such a great challenge to his political standing that it would not be worth the cost of doing that because there was such a norm against that, as I think there still is. It doesn't mean people today aren't challenging the vote. They obviously are. But it's not obviously universal. There still is a pretty strong norm against this. And I think there will be political consequences, maybe not immediately, to doing this. Second, I'm not sure Nixon actually thought that he would win. If he was certain, if he really thought that he would have the advantage, I think he might have considered it, but he didn't. He didn't. He thought the advantage was Kennedy's. And he believed that if they got into that kind of battle, the Kennedy machine would beat him anyway. So it was both pragmatic and about the norms of the time. By the way, just to give another example, John Kerry in 2004 was advised by a few people. I don't know anyone who advised him to challenge the results, but he was advised that he could have challenged the results in Ohio. If you go back and look at that election, if you flip Ohio, John Kerry actually could win that election. It was very close, a few thousand votes in Ohio, I think maybe 10,000 votes or so. And some had asked him to challenge it. He didn't think he'd win the challenge, but he also didn't think it was appropriate to challenge the election. So that is one area where the current administration, which has no chance of reversing the votes. Let me just make that clear. This is not a close election. This is 6 million, maybe more votes in the popular election, and it's tens and hundreds of thousands of votes in a number of states that would have to be reversed. There's no chance that will be reversed, yet they're challenging this. That is what's odd about this moment we're in.
In your teaching, how do you see students reacting to better understanding that partisanship and strife isn't new? Is it reassuring or more concerning to them in your experience?
So it's a great question. I think it does vary on the student. There are a lot of students, I was this way as a student, who hold very strongly to certain views of the past. And I make it clear, I love America and I love American history. I'm not trashing our history at all. I am of the belief that you improve your society by seeing the positives and the negatives, and I do both. I spend a lot of time on Lincoln and I spend a lot of time on what we talked about in part today. I think for many students, I don't want to say for all, for many students, this is empowering, because it gives them a way to see that they are part of a longer struggle, a struggle they can be a part of where they can make a difference. That it's not either set against them or this moment is somehow the end of the world. It's more that this is part of a long time. This is the message I was trying to give to all of us now, right? This is the kind of pep talk, right? This is a moment, we're in a struggle that's a long-term struggle. And we're in one of the more difficult parts of it, but we can struggle our way through. We're actually empowered to make a difference. We were empowered and we effectuated that when we went to vote. And we can continue to do that by continuing to be involved and continuing to talk about this with people and continuing to call the president-elect, and the outgoing president, for example.
Speaking of which, if Joe Biden asked you for advice, what would you tell him to get through the next 10 weeks?
Great question. First, I would say continue to do a lot of what you're doing now. Act like a president-elect. Play the role you should play, unifying the country and addressing the issues that we are most concerned about. He did exactly the right thing to bring together a stellar panel of health policy experts to advise him and to advise the country. We now have a panel we can look to that can offer us at least some guidance. They have no federal power yet, some guidance on how to think about a possible emerging vaccine, mask wearing, things like that. I think he should continue to do those things. Avoid the partisan issues and find the issues, well, there's no issue that's not partisan, but find the issues that are less explicitly partisan, where there's a potential to bring more people together, and perform as president in the waiting. And that will continue to bring people behind you. That will continue to show you the legitimacy of what you're doing. And it's the best way of highlighting how unpresidential the behavior of others are in this moment.
And that leads us into the next question. You mentioned in the past, other leaders have refused to concede that they lost an election. But if our current president also refuses to leave the White House, would you see this as a crisis for our democracy?
Well, I mean, we're in a crisis for our democracy. We're there, right? I mean, we have a president who lost the election, who is telling people he didn't lose, who is telling and requiring his cabinet members to do this, requiring the Senate candidates in Georgia to claim lies. I mean, he is spreading lies. He is spreading lies, and that's a constitutional crisis because we expect the president of the United States, at the very least, to tell us what's happened, right? And to respect the process. So we're in a constitutional crisis. I don't think he's going to get away with it. There's no chance he's going to get away with it. And whether he leaves the White House or not on January 20th, I don't care. You don't have to be in the White House to be president. He will not be in the White House much beyond January 20th. I can assure you of that. But whether he's there, whether he sleeps in the Lincoln bedroom on January 20th night or not is really immaterial. As of noon on January 20th, President-elect Biden will become president of the United States. And I completely assure you that all the main sources of US government, especially the military and others, will immediately recognize Joe Biden as president of the United States. My real worry is that we have a unhinged president who's lost, who is not only trying to pretend he's still going to be president, which is nonsense, but he's also raging and he still has access to a lot of power to do things that could be damaging for the long-term elements of the country after he leaves. And that's what worries me. He also, I think, I've written about this many places, he's deeply in debt. He's the first president we've had who, when leaving office, will face prosecution in New York State, not just federal, state prosecution where there's no pardon possibility. And I'm afraid he's going to try to do things to protect himself, such as enlisting help from others, selling things. Who knows? We're in a space we've never been in before with the levels of possible corruption.
Thank you. So last question. Can you talk about the institution of the Electoral College, its origin and values, and how it fits into a modern America?
It's a great question. The Electoral College is an example. I wish I had more time to talk about a number of these. There's so many of these examples of institutions that were created in a moment that have outlasted their time. And this is one of the reasons I always tell people you have to study history. Many of the things that we have around us, many things we do, reflect decisions of another time that we need to rethink. They don't have to be that way just because they've been that way for a long time. A great example of this is employer-provided healthcare insurance. That was a decision made in World War II for expedience purposes. It makes no sense to have your insurance through your employer because then if you lose your job, you don't have health insurance. It just makes no sense at all. I don't know what the solution is. The Electoral College is another one of those things. The founders didn't actually use the term Electoral College. It's not in the Constitution. They created these things called electors because they couldn't figure out how to elect the president. There was no model. They had models for a parliament and a Congress, models for a court. They didn't have models for a presidency, for an elected This is what James Madison called him, right? An elected citizen patriot king, right? An elected citizen patriot king. It has all the contradictions, right? It's supposed to bring the country together, but not be hereditary. They were against all kinds of hereditary power. And so what they did, because they couldn't imagine how to do this, is they created this system where the states had electors, because otherwise they were afraid that each state would simply nominate its favorite son, as they called it. And that person, you'd have an Ohio nominee, a Massachusetts, and New York, and they couldn't figure it out. So you'd have electors, and then the electors would choose the person. This came to be known as the Electoral College. And it, in effect, did what much of the early apportionment of political power did. It gave disproportionate power to the southern states, because the southern states were able to claim more electors based on the 3/5 clause, where slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. And they had larger territory, so they could have more slaves and more electors. This process then came to protect slavery, which is why the southern states liked it. It gave them more control. Before the Civil War, many of the presidents are southern. After the Civil War, it takes another 70 years to have a southern, 50 years to have another southern president. So the Electoral College grows up like the filibuster, which wasn't supposed to serve the purpose it serves, to protect power in certain regions of the country. And we've remained committed to it for a long time for that reason. We, meaning certain elements of our political system that veto any change on that. It makes no sense. In the last few elections, as many of you know, we've had multiple cases now where the popular vote and the Electoral College vote were either out of sync or potentially out of sync. It gives disproportionate power to states like Wyoming and Montana. It takes power away from states like Texas and California, right? A few 100,000 more votes in Texas doesn't help Donald Trump. A few 100,000 votes in California doesn't help Joe Biden. Those votes should count. Those votes should matter. And it makes the election look closer than it is. Again, this election wasn't close. Biden won by 74 electoral votes. He'll have 306 by the time we're done to Trump's 232. But it made it look closer, and that's not good. So I don't know if the solution is to eliminate the Electoral College and go to a full popular vote. Maybe a modified version would work. I don't know. I think that's a discussion we need to have. Let me just be clear on the key takeaway here, though. The founders never intended for it to work this way as long as it did. They thought it was a compromise, and they actually thought the House of Representatives would choose presidents, as happened in 1800 and in 1828. They expected it would happen, 1824 and 1800. They thought it would work that way. So we're doing something they didn't intend for us to do, and we seem stuck with it because we can't imagine anything different. This is where the courage to imagine new things is important. And I think that will happen. It's not going to happen anytime soon. It's progressively harder and harder to convince people that the Electoral College is a good thing. When I was growing up in the 1990s, in the 80s and 90s, ancient history, right? And when I was growing up then, the Electoral College, you were growing up in the 20-teens, I know, Angie. When I was growing up in the 1980s and 90s, we didn't care about the Electoral College because the elections were not close and it didn't matter. But now that it matters and it distorts things, it's bringing people's attention to this. And I do look for us to change that in the future as we go forward. One last thing, I know there's 1 minute left. We also need a constitutional amendment for a right to vote. Most of the voter suppression we have is because there's no constitutional amendment for a right to vote. The 15th Amendment only prohibits restrictions on voting by race, the 19th Amendment by sex and gender. But there's no right to vote as there is a right to free speech. If we had a right to vote, it would be harder for people to suppress voting. But that's a topic for another lecture. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully we'll get to do that later. So on behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development and Public Affairs teams, we want to thank you, Dr. Suri, for sharing your very valuable time with us.